Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to introduce two individuals who have done a great service in the field of higher education. They haven't just ushered in new ways of reporting or producing news. They have changed the way higher ed is understood. Denise-Marie Ordway is a senior reporter who covers higher education at the Orlando Sentinel. And she has won several top journalism awards for her education reporting. She led a team notably of reporters covering violent hazing in the Florida A&M University Marching Band. And that work was chosen as a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2013. Denise just recently was asked to join the Journalist Advisory Board at the National Education Writers Association. As a first-generation college student, Denise has given the perspectival touch that is often absent in an industry that is lacking socioeconomic diversity. Melissa Bailey is the managing editor for the New Haven Independent, a news website about New Haven, Connecticut. Since 2006, she has helped the Independent grow tremendously. Her stories have appeared in Time, the Christian Science Monitor, the Hetchinger Report, and the Huffington Post. Bailey is a former Knight McCormick Leadership Fellow and an active member of the Education Writers Association. She previously was the lead reporter for the Middletown, Connecticut Press. Please join me in introducing both of them.
Good morning. Good morning. Very glad to see you guys here. Forgive me, I'm not a great public speaker. I'm a writer. I know you guys, your brains are firing right now, and you've got a lot of really great story ideas you want to take back to your homes, and I'm hoping to give you guys some good story ideas to take too. Before I do that, I just wanted to take a minute to encourage you guys today to take advantage of this opportunity to get to know, meet the journalists who are working with you guys today. I know myself, I'm so glad to be here. I'm thrilled to be here. And I'd like to be a resource for you. So if you have questions in this session or afterwards, I want you to feel comfortable to come up and ask them. I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to first talk to you about a series that I did in the years 2011, 2012, and 2013, focusing on the series began with a focus on hazing at Florida A&M University in Florida. I work out of the Orlando office, and FAMU, we call it FAMU, is located in Tallahassee, which is almost 4 hours away. A lot of tough reporting. Let me get this. Is it working? Forgive me. Still loading. Okay. So I thought this would be a really great example of a way that you can, as higher education reporters, initiate change. The higher education beat is hands down my favorite beat. I love covering higher education. I've covered education generally for 15 years, and higher education is a part of that, but I've covered higher education exclusively for 4 years now. The story of the hazing at FAMU came to my attention in the fall of 2011 because FAMU's marching band and its football team, they were in Orlando for a football game. And what happened was there was a hazing at a hotel in Orlando, and this young man was killed. He was beaten to death on a charter bus. So we initially got interested in the story that way because, a young man had died. So I got pulled onto the story too with the police reporter and just started, asking questions about this young man hazing, like who would be willing to be hazed to be in a marching band? That just seemed kind of silly to me because when I grew up, being in the band was not the coolest thing in the world. So I was like, people are willing to be beaten. Severely beaten, suffocated, just horrible things done to them to be in a marching band. But one thing I learned was that this marching band was a very big deal. It's a very talented group. It's a very famous group. They've been on TV commercials. And as I learned, marching bands at historically black colleges and universities are very much a source of pride in the black community nationally. So as I started learning that, I started realizing the significance of this event. So to make a long story short, I started investigating the school. I found out that within the school, there was a very long tradition of violent hazing within the marching band, and different sections even, the clarinet section, the drum section, they had their own hazing rituals. I kept digging. I found out things like a private meeting that the dean of students and the marching band director and the police chief held like days before they came to Orlando when that young man was killed. The police chief himself and the dean had said, don't send the band to Orlando. You need to suspend the band because the violence is getting out of hand. So I used public records and interviewing skills to kind of bring that to the forefront. And then, I was able to learn things like, a third of the band should have never been in the band because they weren't actually students at the school. And another third probably shouldn't have been in the band because they didn't have the grades to be in the band. They had grades as low as a 0.17. So I shouldn't have been in the band. So I just kept digging and digging and digging, and what I was able to eventually find, and forgive me, it's still not coming up.
It just keeps timing out. I don't know if you want to go through.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so I had found that, there was this tradition of hazing going back. The dean had urged for the band to be suspended. People were getting bad grades, shouldn't have been in the band. Did more digging and found out a lot of problems with financial mismanagement. They had been faking audits. They had been doing a summary of an audit that was never done and doing this over years. And then I found issues related to academics. They were allowing large numbers of students who didn't meet basic criteria to come into the college. So all of these things were happening. It was kind of a snowball. It captured a lot of people's attention, and eventually a lot of people were fired or prompted to leave, or they suddenly retired early, including the police chief and the band director, the university president. And a lot of changes came about because of the reporting. Departments were reformed, policies were reformed. They started to do things differently. The university had its accreditation suspended, which, as you know, is a very big deal. So all of these big changes were coming about because of the work I'd put in, the stuff I was finding over the course of this, almost 2 years. So I wanted to, like I said, give that as an example of something really great you can do with higher education reporting. If you do the research, you take advantage of your natural curiosity, you can do some really strong work. And like I said, higher education, I love that beat. I love it. There's so much interesting stuff to do with it. But I'll let Melissa talk some about what she does too.
Thank you. So I'll tell you. So I'm managing editor for the New Haven Independent. Is anyone here from New Haven or Yale? Yes, sort of.
The area.
You're from there. Where do you?
Meriden.
There. Oh, okay. So the New Haven Independent is part of a new wave that Josh Benton was telling you a little bit about. So online news sites that emerged in the wake of cutbacks at legacy print institutions. So we've been around for 10 years, which is quite a long time in this industry. We're not for profit, and we started because no one was covering the city of New Haven. The legacy newspaper was perpetually in bankruptcy, had laid off a lot of its editorial staff. No one was covering the schools or showing up to city government meetings and playing this watchdog role that's so important to the vitality of the city. So my editor, Paul Bass, was this longtime, fierce, investigative reporter who worked for the local alt-weekly paper for years and years. And went to Yale, graduated in '82, just devoted his life to community journalism. So he started The Independent. And so we're a community news website. We're not covering campus in the way that you might covering what classes are being offered this year, or are there foam parties in the basements of fraternities. We cover Yale as an employer, and as a landlord, and as a business. So I don't know about where you live, but in New Haven, Yale and Yale New Haven Hospital are the two biggest employers in town by far. I mean, this is like a company town, and the university is the company. So when we cover a campus, we think of it that way. We're covering almost like your beat is this company, and how does it interact with the city, and who works there? How is the place that it's located in affected by it? So I'll give you some examples. We've covered a lot about the labor strife at Yale. When I was an undergraduate there, 2000 to 2004, there were big strikes on campus. There's been a lot of strife between the blue-collar and white-collar workers and the institution. The latest contract was actually settled quite amicably. This was 2 months ago, but the last two, they finally came to peace. And so I actually was able to, I think I just walked into this meeting and I had some friends in the union that tipped me off that this was happening, so I was able to run down and get into this union meeting and write about this sort of secret meeting they were having to sign this breakthrough deal to approve their contract 6 months early. So that was unheard of. Before, negotiations would drag out, people were just defaming each other in the streets. So I think having good sources within the unions, this might be secretaries in the department that you're studying in. This might be the person that's serving you food in the cafeteria. Those people are as much as part of a campus as students are, and can be great sources for stories. So we also cover Yale as a landlord. This is a controversy over these 2 streets that were on campus that Yale had acquired, I think it was 50 years ago, I can't remember. And they had become basically pedestrian thoroughfares. And the city said, yeah, you can have them for a few decades, and then we'll renegotiate. And then it became this sort of flashpoint for conflict between the city of New Haven and Yale over who gets the rights to these streets. And I found that, so this story, if I were sitting on campus, I wouldn't necessarily know this story. I would know the story because I'm going to the City Hall, to the Board of Aldermen, and looking through all the filings about proposals for what's coming up on the next Board of Aldermen meeting. So being a good City Hall reporter often leads you to great stories on campus. So this is a story that broke my heart about New Haven's greatest bar, the Anchor, which tragically closed in January. And so people were, I actually happened to be in New Haven. I was here, but was in New Haven for this story. This bar is closing. Facebook's blowing up. Like, everyone loves this bar. It was sort of for graduate students, this big hangout for people who, celebrities who go and act in a theater right down the street and then come for a drink. So this was just this legendary watering hole, and it closed. And initially the thought was sort of like, oh, let's reminisce about this bar. And I said, no, this is owned by Yale. And people were just furious about this bar closing. And it ended up being a story not just about a bar, but about the relationship between Yale and the companies, and the properties that it owned. And it became, not just a sort of nightlife story, but actually a pretty significant story about how Yale treats its tenants. And it was in this pattern of a lot of these institutions, like the Greasy Spoon diners and the record shop and the old movie theater that had just periodically closed, even in the 14 years that I had lived in New Haven. So I think knowing which properties your university owns is key to being able to understand the university in context. And in New Haven, it's not Yale particularly, it's Yale University properties, but they're all related, and you can get a lot of good stories. We heard that this toy store was closing. Like, okay, maybe not a lot of people care about a toy store closing, but it turns out it was a pattern of tenants just failing in this Yale-owned property. And it really became a story about urban planning and how do we attract tenants who actually survive in this environment. So in all this time, as I mentioned briefly in the story about the labor contract, access is key. Like getting in the door, getting into that union hall where they're voting, getting into the board meetings if you have a public university. How many people are from a public university? Oh, great, okay. So you have a somewhat easier job because a lot of these meetings are public, right? The Board of Trustees will have public meetings, they're publicly posted. You demand access and they should give it to you. A lot of other, if you're other campus, if you're a private university, it might be a little more difficult. But I've always taken the approach of demanding access. So I've covered the public school system, which obviously is public. But there have been some situations where we've gotten kicked out of public meetings, and we always tell reporters, turn on your video camera. Like just if they're kicking you out of the room, like just politely, not, don't get aggressive in people's face. Turn on your video camera and ask them why.
It has been my experience that you have to learn how to deal with spokespeople, whether it be a university spokesperson or a school district spokesperson. It's going to be a part of your life if you cover education. You have to learn how to work around them. And some of them can be very aggressive. I've been followed to the bathroom. They can be aggressive. I'm going to give you just some quick tips, some advice that I would have liked to have had when I was your age. One key thing for me, because I really like public records, is know your state's public records laws and be familiar with FERPA.
Oh, wait, sorry, I took out this.
Okay. FERPA stands for Federal Education, something privacy, record privacy?
There's the Act. Sorry, I took out the acronym.
Something like that. I had it on there so I'd remember. I always forget it, and we just often refer to it as FERPA. Mm-hmm. And even if you are a private university, you need to know your state's public records law. Because if you're doing a good job covering your campus, you're not just going to be on campus. You're going to be looking at records at state offices or federal offices, whether it be the Federal Department of Education, maybe a local planning board, maybe your state environmental protection agency, whatever that looks like, city hall, those kinds of things. You'll want to be familiar with what you're allowed to have, because the best tool you can have in your toolkit is to be very familiar with what you are allowed to have, what meetings you can have access to, what documents you can have, when they have to provide them. Be familiar with that, because sometimes they will try to pretend they don't know, or sometimes they're not clear themselves. Sometimes city governments or other government agencies are not always clear themselves on what the law says. And then obviously FERPA, which deals with student privacy information. I have had lots of quarrels with universities and school districts over that kind of information, because often a school district or a university will kind of just blanket prohibit me from having something, and you have to be able to, if it's accurate, explain, I want records that are not going to identify a student. Like the story that I did about the marching band when I was looking at grades. It took me, if I remember correctly, 8, 9, 10 months to get those records, because they were saying that they were forbidden from being released, but I just wanted GPAs. I just wanted to know what were the GPAs of the band members. I didn't want to know if it was Steve Smith or, Jan Jones. I just wanted GPAs, and finally got them and was able to do the story that showed that the band GPAs were really bad in many cases. And
It'll come back, it's just timed out.
Okay. Sorry. The next one is follow the money. That's one of my favorite pieces of advice. Know where your money is coming from and where it's going. If you're working for a public university, that's going to be much harder to do. When it comes to a private university, it's oftentimes a lot about sourcing. Sometimes stuff that they won't release, if you have a good relationship, they might release it or release some details, or someone else can give you tidbits of information. But like a good piece of advice is know where the funding is, where it's coming from, the various streams, know where it's going. Because then you can also follow it to other interest groups, other agencies connected to the university, the various constituencies that are connected to your school. I love this piece of advice. It kind of seems silly, but it helps a lot. Read bulletin boards everywhere you go. When you're walking through the hallways, or you're at the grocery store, or an apartment complex, wherever you see billboards, read them. I've gotten story ideas off billboards, and at the very, very least, you kind of get a feel for the color of a community, what's important, quirky factoids that might be, maybe not evident to you on campus. It might be a different student group, or, just read bulletin boards, because they're really interesting, and they'll give you some information you may not have realized. Make sure you stay up to date on what's going on with your national media, whether that be trends that you may identify on your campus, or maybe not yet. It might be coming to your campus. It just hasn't happened yet. Same way with events, tragedy. Just be aware of what's going on in other parts of the country, so that when if something does happen on your campus, you can, in a very authoritative way, put it into context. So you're giving some more information to your reader. I have one more piece of advice that I realized this morning that I wanted to share with you, that was actually my favorite piece of advice when I was a young reporter. Someone told me, when you're writing a story, always go back and call the different sources of your stories the next day to check with them. Was that accurate? Was I fair? How did you feel about how I presented that information? Sometimes it will be uncomfortable, because you'll be writing something very critical, very controversial, and you'll know that they're not happy with the story. But if you're calling back to make sure you're accurate, that shows someone that what you're doing is important to you, that you want to get it right, and that relationship over time will grow. Sure.
So, for example, when you were working on the piece about the marching band, which is obviously like a very controversial issue and can have a real world impact.
Yes.
How did you ensure that you sort of kept your distance from such an emotionally charged issue, and also were able to represent the narrative in a way that you thought was accurate?
You also always have to stay on guard. I mean, as I went to campus and I would meet band members and have coffee with them. I went to McDonald's with some students, and I'd meet with professors and faculty and alumni. You have to just get into a habit of trying to stay as objective as you can, and always know there are many sides to a story. Many sides. You might be covering a story where your heart goes out to this person and you feel like they are absolutely right and what was done to them was wrong. You have to put your feelings aside and go, yeah, but that's one side. There's so many, every story has multiple sides, and you have to represent them all as best you can. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. And then I wanted to offer you guys some mistakes to avoid. Hopefully that'll help you out. Do not stay on campus. I know you guys are covering your universities and your university media. Do not stay on campus. Stuff, like I explained with the public records, check out the documents that are in your local courthouse, your county courthouse, your district courthouse. You'll see who's suing your schools. And sometimes you can spend a day looking at lawsuits, and some of them are boring and don't mean anything, and some of them are fascinating and will kind of give you some insight into a whole new realm of your school you don't even realize. So go to these other government, nonprofit entities and explore. Just, use your natural curiosity and explore. Melissa has touched on this already. Do not let public officials or officials at your university push you around. Don't let them tell you can't be in a meeting when you know you can. Don't let them see your notes before you publish something. You don't have to. Know your rights, stand your ground. They will try. A lot of them will try. And do not let them see your story before you publish it. I still get that. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I still get, can I see your story before you publish it? No, you cannot. If this is a source who's unfamiliar with me, maybe a parent who doesn't know what it's like to work with a reporter, or a lower level administrator they're nervous about working with me, before the story runs, I will call them back and say, just to clarify, this is what I understood you said to me. And sometimes I will read their quote back to them, but I will never, under any circumstance, let them read any part of my story, not a paragraph, definitely not a full story. So, and you will get those requests, sure.
Our school has a public relations department that mandates that they see all of our questions to a professor, a head of department in advance, and that's something we obviously hate. We want to break away, but we're worried about or push back if we say, no, we're not doing that anymore. Are we going to have like months of us never having any higher education stories? Like, how do you have any advice on not letting them see our questions and just like getting around them more often?
Sure. Depending on the situation, depending on the faculty member, depending on the story, sometimes I might have some I might have some wiggle room on that. I will try always to reach out to the faculty member directly, and if that person is the expert in this subject, a lot of universities have 8 experts in a general subject. So you go to someone else. Oftentimes someone will help you. I try not to go through the media office because I don't want them to know everything I'm doing. Sometimes you have to. And sometimes I will be working on a story where this is the person I have to talk to. I have to get their input for the story to be fair, and I will agree to share certain questions with them. But I try not to. Sometimes I feel like I need to, and if I want that information and that viewpoint bad enough, I'm okay with sharing some questions. There are some situations where I won't be requested to share questions, but I will. Like, for example, maybe I'm interviewing someone who is out of the country and our time zones are off, and I can't get them by the phone, and I'll have to, hey, can you answer some questions for me? And they'll email back. Sometimes I've done that. So it's kind of like you have to work around your time schedule. Sometimes you have to be flexible. But when it comes to kind of your day-to-day, what you're doing, just try not to let them push you around because they will assume that they can if you let them. I mean, you can work with them. You don't have to be rude, but you don't want them knowing all your business because they'll try to. Their job is to make the university look good. That's their job. They get paid very well for that.
If I could jump in, I would encourage you to write a story about what's the university policy on interviewing professors. I mean, now with the internet, you can generate a lot of public awareness of a policy that you think is unfair. I mean, I've seen cases in Connecticut where the local press has covered policies like that on campus. This campus is stonewalling their press. They demand to see every article before it's published. Like, that's BS. This is 2015, and we have the internet. We have freedom of speech, and I would fight it. Yeah.
Forgive me for my technological ignorance here. Oh, drats. Okay, I kind of touched on this already. Do not get lazy about getting the other side. You know where that gets you, in major trouble. You need to work your tail off to get every side, even if it means going to that person's home and leaving a note, sending a certified letter, a fax. Especially, the more controversial the story is, the more hurtful it can be to them personally, the harder you have got to try to reach that person and get them to comment. So just don't be lazy because sometimes, we're under deadlines and we're overworked and you guys are dealing with classes and writing. It can be easy to go, maybe I won't try as hard. I just called one time and they didn't call me back. The more controversial it is, the harder you've got to try to get them. Okay, this is another one. I read a lot of campus newspapers, and one thing that has been frustrating to me is they a lot of times assume that the reader knows as much as the writer does, and especially now when so much of your coverage is digital, you're getting a lot more parents reading what you're doing, community members reading what you're doing, other media, professional media reading what you're doing. And so kind of like, as you're writing, kind of keep that in mind to maybe go an extra step to explain something, or don't use maybe a phrase that your mom wouldn't know. So just kind of keep that in mind that there are a lot more people outside your campus who are reading what you're writing. Goodness.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So we just want to give you a few story ideas that you can take home. Feel free to jump in with questions. The administrator perks. Does your campus president have a fancy car? You had some great examples. getting crazy trips to wherever.
Yes, yes.
What is the benefits package and the salary of your top administrators in your school? So these can be found. Does anyone know, who knows what a 990 is? Have you ever looked at one? So if you're a not-for-profit organization, you're required to file this tax form called a 990, and it's just a trove for great information. You can find it on GuideStar. It's a public website that keeps track of all these 990s, and you can find out all sorts of things about the organization, how much people are paid, and it includes a section on top administrators, top principals in the organization's benefits or compensation packages. Also, luckily, your nice friends at the Chronicle of Higher Ed have already done all this work for you. And they combed through these 990s. I met the woman who does this. This is like her whole job, is to look through all these tax documents for y'all. And so you can search your college and find out people's salaries with this great database. So thank the folks at the Chronicle.
Yeah, you'd be surprised sometimes at what they get, the perks they get. I know I covered one school that had a bodyguard, and it was a public university, so public tax dollars were going for this person to have a bodyguard.
Yeah, our mayor had a bodyguard too. Okay, court records. We talked about who's suing. Federal court records are all online, or you go to your local courthouse. There can be fun stuff like trip and fall. Everyone's falling on this one sidewalk on campus, and they're all suing. Or it can be serious stuff about discrimination by age or gender on the job. And the discrimination suits will all be federal cases, so know how to find those court cases. They're great. And I find, at least in New Haven, like no one's looking at these court records just because it's sort of a pain. So by doing it, you can scoop your local media, I'm sure. Student housing. I think this is just something that isn't often covered. The Globe did a great job with this very... sorry, awkward to handle media package, but they did this great investigation of students... Sorry? It's like Snowfall-esque. This great investigation of where students are living in the Boston area and these really overcrowded conditions. So they pulled all these inspection reports and did these public record requests that you may not think of if you're just staying on campus thinking about campus. So think about where people are living off campus as well. Now, how much does college really cost? So you probably know what your tuition is, but what's the average person on campus actually paying, right? Once they get their loans and once they get their scholarships. So the folks at Hechinger Report and the Dallas Morning News compiled this wonderful database. Give me a college name.
Brown University.
Brown.
This is really fun to play with.
Yeah. So they looked at how much students are actually paying. So at the top, you see the sticker price, but they also did the net price, which is what people are actually paying for people in different income groups. So this is a really wonderful database, and I encourage you to look at it for your own school. It particularly shows, students who don't make much money. It looks like Brown is actually doing a great job of discounting tuition. They're paying about $5,000, but you can compare, colleges in your area. How much aid are they really offering to poor kids? So we have 3 websites we found really helpful in our careers. Education Writers Association, we're not being paid by them, I promise. They're a not-for-profit association. This has been just this wonderful resource for me as a reporter. I worked for a really small community newspaper, and this was the one place I had suddenly these hundreds of peers who will answer emails and help me on stories. So there's a higher ed list that I encourage you to sign up for. People are incredibly helpful if you say, hey, I have this problem on campus, like for the woman who asked about the policy problems when interviewing professors. I think that's a great kind of question to pose to people on this list who've been around for a while on the beat. There are also wonderful let me see if I can find it. Tip sheets for different resources. Sorry, different. All right, I'm not finding it at this moment, but I'm sure you are all very good at navigating websites. So they have tip sheets. So say it's like Common Core or, college tuition. They'll have a whole primer, like here's the latest on college tuition. Here are some links to stories, and here's how you can cover the beat. I mean, it's incredible. So I really encourage you to check out that website. Do you want to talk about these two?
Sure. When you cover higher education, these kind of websites are going to be your best friend because they got lots of data that you can manipulate really quickly, and they will tell you a lot. And also, it's very easy to look at other schools' data if you want to do comparisons. This is This is the website that schools, private and public, are required to report certain crime, types of crime to the federal government in order to get federal aid. So whether it be Harvard or University of Central Florida, everybody's going to do it, or you don't get federal aid. Those you won't be able to get grants and such for your students. And you can go in here and you can look at one institution and you find out what kind of institution you want to look at and look at all kinds of crimes, whether it be alcohol or sex offenses or fire in an on-campus housing, lots of different types of crimes. Now I will tell you, and these are stories also, I will tell you that in some cases, the crime reporting is not consistent. I found a case, I'm from Florida, and I cover University of Central Florida, a mammoth campus with 60,000 students. And I cover a tiny little private college, Rollins College, which has like 4. And was looking at their sex offense data. And Rollins College had at the time more reports of sex offenses than University of Central Florida. So I'm like, that's either a major story or something's not right. And so according to who you talk to, there is some inconsistency in how things are reported. So you need to be aware of that.
Should I do this for you?
Sure.
We just want iPads, right?
That's just a great website to go to because every single year they're required to give new data. And it gives data for campuses too, not just main campus, for satellite campuses too. This is a catch-all. It's got all kinds of data, and if you just want to look up different graduation rates or information about financial aid for your campus or another school, this one, it just has tons and tons and tons of graphics and data. Some of them let you build your own data sets. So you can look at trends over time for your school, for a certain student group. Just play with it when you get some time. If you're not familiar with it, probably some of you are, just take some time to play with it because you'll be like, wow, I didn't know that about my school. That's really fascinating. I do that at my desk all the time, and people are like, oh, this is really cool. I didn't know this. And I've been doing this for a while, so you'll still find new stuff if you kind of play around with it. I tried to keep it short, tried to give you guys some short tips.
So we're coming up upon lunch, but we'll take any final questions that you have. Yeah.
So I guess this question is more geared towards young reporters. My experience at Boston College is that there's probably between 20 and 30 people whose job it is to sort of create stories about the college. They're paid by the college, and they're in this big beautiful house, and they type up all these beautiful things about the school, and we're inundated with these teacher wins this award, this is happening, and it seems like there's this very dense fabric of news that's already curated for you by the school. And I guess when you're reporting on Disneyland, how do you pierce past the fabric and try to sift through those stories, or do you just how do you distance yourself from that sort of created image of the school?
Sure. I mean, I would say, maybe a teacher wins professor wins an award, I'll give it a photo and a quick link. We're not going to re-report that story. I'm sure there's some something you can link to, and then focus on the reporting that you want to do that will make your newspaper stand out, and that's more original and sort of a watchdog capacity reporting. I know what you think.
You have to also keep in mind that this group of people, their job is to make your university look good. That's their job. A lot of times they're paid well. They're not going to, oftentimes they're not likely to show the bad side or a problem or highlight a concern. So I do read, I get them, I get the press releases, I get them, and sometimes they're very interesting, and they might have a nugget of interesting information that I might go, ooh, that sounds fascinating, and I'll use that to build for another story. Oftentimes, sometimes I might blog, it'll be interesting enough that I'll kind of blog about it. In my newsroom, we have lots of different ways we can use information. We can write a story that only runs online, we can run a story that runs in print and online, and we can blog. So we've got a lot of ways we can use information. Some of it is good stuff. Some of it is interesting. And I'll a lot of times blog about it. But it kind of depends on what the issue is. Positive stuff still is good news sometimes. and stuff that your readers want to read about. But you have to weigh every piece individually to see kind of what the value is for your readers.
What's the balance between pushing these spokespeople and working with them? Like, at least in my experience, a lot of times if you want to talk to one of the higher officials, I'm from Brown, like if you want to talk to one of them, like the dean of the grad school or President Paxson, like you have to go through those people, and sometimes they're even present, you know, while you're speaking with them. So I mean, how do you, I'm afraid that, you know, if you just bypass them completely, that you're not going to get access to this person. So like, how do you make those decisions?
That's true.
Especially being a young reporter.
That's true. I mean, and I run into it too. I will try to request an interview by myself, and if I've developed a relationship well enough with that certain administrator, then I can just meet with him or her by myself, and I don't need the spokesperson. But I mean, I will tell you, if you go into education, spokespeople you're going to have to deal with them. You just have to learn to deal with them in whatever the situation is. Sometimes you're just going to have to, if you really, really want to get that administrator, you're going to have to let that person sit there, pretend they're not there. The administrator will be less likely to be swayed by a spokesman or woman than a teacher or a parent. If I'm meeting with a teacher or parent, I meet at McDonald's or their house, where that spokesperson is not going to be there.
Yeah, I've run into this a lot with our mayor. You know, the spokesmen are always trying to get in just stand in front of you, you know, and be there. So often I'll submit a couple questions by email to kind of placate them, but then go to the press conference, grab the mayor before or after. Usually, I mean, depending on their personality, they might be willing to have a direct interview in a more informal setting if you just catch them in person. So especially if you're at a public institution, your president's calendar should be public record, so know where your president is all the time. Yep. And even if you're at Brown, I mean, you can still, you know, there are tons of public events you could try to catch administrators at.
And how do you know, if you want to explain to a spokesman or a spokeswoman, hey, you know, it would be much more beneficial for my story to be able to just talk to this teacher one-on-one without you there, like how do you word that? And if they push back, you know, how do you like keep pressing it without, you know, it getting very, very confrontational?
If they're doing their job, they're going to push you till you give in, if they're doing their job, because they want to make sure they control the information. That's their job, to make sure they know what's going to be in print, what information is being shared with you. If it's a faculty member or a teacher, anyone who is not administration, I just try my best to get them off campus so that there's not that person wanting to show up and be in your interview. And then when it comes to higher level administration, sometimes you just have to allow them there and you ignore them and just hope that, you know, eventually over time, if you get that relationship with the administrator, they'll not have them there. That's my best advice. Sometimes you just have to have them there and ignore them. Like I said, I go to meetings. I'll be followed to the bathroom sometimes because they think I might try to interview someone and they're not seeing it.
So thank you all. We'll be here during lunch if you have any questions.